right, welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. This is episode 49. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and today we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Daniela Bevilacqua. Daniela is currently a researcher at the Center for Research in Anthropology at the University Institute of Lisbon. Welcome back to the Yogic Studies podcast. Daniela G, how are we doing today?
Thank you so much, Seth. I'm fine. I'm very happy to be here and to talk with you again in this fantastic platform.
It is very exciting to have you back to discuss and to celebrate your newly published book that I'm holding here in my hand, in the print, in the flesh here, From Tapas to Modern Yoga, Sādhus' Understanding of Embodied Practices. And for many of our listeners, for those watching, you will probably be very familiar with Daniela and this book. You've heard about it many times before. Daniela was actually on the podcast. I had to go back and look. You were actually the second episode I ever did.
Yeah,
back in, when was it? August 2019, if you can believe it.
Oh my God.
So what's that? Over 5 years ago, we
Oh my God.
did that. That's crazy, right? And before that, we had you teach an incredible online course here at Yogic Studies on some of this very material, YS 103, Yoga and Hindu Asceticism. So you were actually also one of the first instructors that I invited to come on to teach at Yogic Studies.
Yeah, I had this great honor indeed. And it took, I'm just thinking that it took so much time to write the book eventually.
It did, and we'll talk about that. I mean, there's a lot of hard work, sweat and tears, and so much labor that you put into this, and it really does show. So, but I also bring that up to say, go back and listen to that first episode with Daniela, episode 2. We talk more about her background and her story, and her journey of how she got into academia and became an anthropologist. But
really?
Today, yeah, it's amazing. You should listen to it.
I should. I never listen back.
But today, though, we're really going to dive into this book, and we really want to talk about From Tapas to Modern Yoga. Now, you actually told me something interesting. You said that some of the chapters and the structure of this book was actually shaped or influenced by the course you did for Yogic Studies.
Yeah, because basically when I was preparing the course, I knew that I had to prepare also the book. So I tried to help myself structuring the course in a way that could be helpful for the book. And so basically, if you do the course, you can use the book as a kind of a textbook for that. And so it was very useful to prepare that course and then to develop it in a full entire book.
Absolutely.
So now you should add it in the bibliography.
We will, certainly. So for those, especially though, who might be newer to your work and to this particular subject, tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book. How did this come to be?
Okay, very simple question, basically. Okay, so this book is the outcome of the Hatha Yoga Project, let's say the side of the project related to my work, which was collecting knowledge and understanding of yoga and Hatha Yoga among contemporary sadhus in India. But because I am in between ethnographer, historians, of course, before jumping into the field, I had also to understand the history of yoga and the history also of the different groups I worked with. And this is reflected in the book because I thought this book for, let's say, an average person, not an academic, someone who's interested in the sadhu society, interested in yoga and the history of yoga, the development of yoga related to ascetic groups. And then, of course, interested in the living traditions. And so, this is how the book was structured. Like the way I function, that I have to put together history and, of course, to connect the history with the present, and at the same time create a structure that is like chronological, so that people can really step by step learn and get those knowledge that will be necessary to understand the next chapters, and especially to understand the approach of sadhus.
Yeah, so you mentioned that this came out of the Hatha Yoga Project, which our listeners will probably be very familiar with. We've talked about, on numerous occasions on this podcast, this 5-year ERC-funded project from 2015 to 2020. I think it's worth kind of mentioning again just how important and influential and special that research project really was, and continues to be for reshaping our understanding of yoga and Indian religious traditions. The publications are now sort of finally coming out one by one, and we now are kind of reaping the fruits of this incredible labor. For those who don't know, this was run by Dr. James Mallinson, Jason Birch, Mark Singleton, and Daniela Bevilacqua. So you really served as the ethnographer for this project, whereas a lot of the other work was philological, was textual, reconstructing yoga's past through Sanskrit texts, as well as through architectural, art historical sources as well. But talk a little bit about, how important the ethnographic element of that project was, and why you were brought in to kind of complement the textual work.
Yeah, I mean, this is also because James Mallinson has also this kind of approach. He's also part of a religious sampradāya tradition in India, so he knew the importance of putting together textual sources together with contemporary practitioners. And of course, he wanted someone who was able to handle that kind of society, or simply have to know how to behave in that kind of society, able to, spend time with sadhus. And so also the importance of speaking Hindi, because you need, especially if you read the book, at the end you will see the list of the people I worked with. And so most of them are not international sadhus, they cannot speak English. And for me, it was important to reach those kind of sadhus who are not too much influenced by modern yoga or too much by modernity, let's say. And related to what you were saying with the Hatha Yoga Project, I think the impact was enormous, because I think the project really opened up the branch of Hatha Yoga, the importance of exploring Hatha Yoga. And also I think we realized how limited was, in a sense, the Hatha Yoga Project, because while we were working in the project, we realized that there was much more. For example, vernacular sources, for example, doing more ethnographic work. And so it's like, you start a process which is already great, because as you said, a lot of critical editions are being published, and others will be out by the end of the year, next year's. And of course, we are slow, I'm sorry, but it's like, when you have so much material, you also have to digest. And I think this is what happened with the Hatha Yoga Project. We started and we realized that there was a lot to actually collect and understand. So that's why we are taking a lot of time. And that's also what one outcome of the project is, that the space that has been open has to be digged like completely, because there is much more that we can understand. And especially I focus on 4 sampradāyas, right? But there are many more. Right. And of course, from each of them, we can get a different nuance, a different understanding. And especially, as I mentioned before, if we consider vernacular sources, which were probably closer to the practice of ascetic traditioners at that time. And so these are like, the gaps that are still there, but this is exciting because it means that the field is opened and ready.
Yeah, in my mind, one of the great strengths of this book is that it foregrounds the lived experience and voices of sadhus in India today. And that might seem like a simple and obvious thing, but and there has been great work done on sadhus and ascetics in India, and there's been anthropological studies on that. But I think not really within the context of yoga studies and not taking into account all of this new research and historical information we have on yoga. So bringing all of that to bear and to be able to take those and ask these questions and to get that from sadhus themselves, I think is one of the things that makes this so unique and I think makes this such an important contribution to yoga studies, but also Hindu and South Asian studies. So,
if I can add,
yeah,
also wanted to, I think let me know. I mean, you read the book, so maybe I wanted also to show sadhus as human beings, like because sometimes the approach that you find in text also, I mean, in books, in monograph on sadhus, there is a kind of idealization sometimes. There is the sadhu and not much the human being. While I wanted to stress, like, there are sadhus who are also sometimes just human beings who are on the path. And so this, I hope, could be a way to approach sadhus in a different way, just as human beings from whom we can learn a lot, but also we can pay attention sometimes because especially I spent a lot of time in India and I've seen like good sadhus, bad sadhus. So sometimes it's good not to idealize them. And so to have this kind of vivid portraits can be useful even to that, I hope.
absolutely. So let's start simply. What is a sadhu? Sometimes different terms are thrown around, right? You have ascetic or renunciate, or even maybe Baba or Swami, or a lot of these different terms. It gets a little bit confusing for folks. So
Yeah.
what sadhu is in the title of your book and is kind of the preferred term that you use throughout your work. So what is a sadhu in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a synonym for ascetic, let's say. We had this conversation in the Yoga Vidya conference, and it was, I think, from the room, this very good question. And in fact, it's complicated to describe like who's a sadhu because we can use different perspective. Like, if we just look at etymologically, it could be like a good person. So not necessarily an ascetic. Could be also an household person who is a good person, a wise person, a holy person, let's say. And so not necessarily this association between sadhu and ascetic is present. But also in the Indian context, who is an ascetic is very different. It depends on the religious context. So it's complicated. I think I wanted to use sadhu as a synonym for ascetic, using a more local term, because also if you read the book, there are different typologies of ascetics. So there is the sannyasin, there is the vairagi, and so it's very difficult to use all these kind of different terms because each has a specific meaning. And so I use sadhu as a kind of umbrella term so that I can put in this, let's say, Hindi term or Sanskrit term, different meaning related to asceticism, renunciation.
So, who were the main types of sadhus that you interviewed for the book? You mentioned, and I appreciate at the back of the book, you have an appendix where you feature, I think it's 109 sadhus
Yes.
in the book. You couldn't get to 108, huh? You had one extra.
Yeah, that could have been good but then it would be fake.
Exactly. 109 sadhus, and you provide a nice little shortened biography or description of who they are in the back, which itself is actually just an incredible resource, I think, of, just the lives of these sadhus. So tell us a little bit about who they are, and maybe briefly kind of the main religious orders or sampradāyas that you looked at.
Yeah, I mean, if you will go through the book in the appendix, you will see that the majority of the sadhus are from the Daishnami Sampradaya, a Shaiva group, and especially from the Akhara, and especially from the Juna Akhara, because I was looking for those sadhus related to embodied practices, so physical practices like the practice of asanas, Hatha Yoga, so Shatkarmas, Mudra, as well as Tapasya, because there is a big section in the book on austerities, Tapasya. And so I was looking for these specific groups where these practices are traditionally practiced. So Akharas are more, have more this kind of religious path focused on physical training. So the Akharas were a good starting point. And of course, I also then went to the Ramanandi Sampradaya because I did my PhD. So that was quite easy to pick, and especially as a subgroup of the Ramanandi Sampradaya, which is that of the Tyagi and Mahatyagi, because they do, especially they do yoga and Hatha Yoga, and Jim is very much connected to this section of the Ramanandi. So I moved in these groups that we historical also have textual sources produced in Shaiva context, Ramanandi context, and not context, of course, because part of the sadhus I talked with were also from the Nat Sampradaya, and very few from those Udasina Akhara, because it's a bit smaller, and I would have loved to work more, but I mean, I was alone, so you also have to use the time as you can. So basically I focus on these four orders because we have connection. I had connections, but also because historically they are related to the practice, and I want to look for basically from I started in Banaras, the fieldwork, because I know very well the city, and you can find representatives of all these groups there. So this was the first starting point. And so they are very local sadhus. And then from there, I moved to religious festivals. Again, very local sadhus. So I moved just looking for local sadhus, not the big stars, because then it's, sometimes they give it to you what you are expecting. And
right.
I just wanted someone.
You use the term grassroots sadhus in the book. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, local sadhus and people who are very much related and rooted in their tradition. So I would say, I mean, all of them are religious people, of course, but those who really, are very more rooted, let's say, some of them are more modern. They have very few had foreigners, disciples, but I was really much looking for those without this kind of connection with more international backgrounds.
So tell us a little bit about the field work, even logistically, like how did you approach, these different periods of field work, and how did you set out to meet these sadhus, to establish these relationships, and what was sort of your process like? Tell us a little bit about what this was like to spend time with them in this sadhu society, and how did you go about carrying out these interviews?
I mean, the most important thing is time. Basically, I spent a lot of time in India during the Hatha Yoga Project. I used to stay 6 months in India every year. And so, as I said, I started in Banaras, and I was 4 months in Banaras. But there, I knew already the places, like in the Ramanandi ashrams or monasteries that are there. They knew already me. They knew me already, so it was easier to start a kind of conversation on these topics. And for the others, I just arrived. Basically, I introduced myself, and I introduced the kind of study that I was doing, and see the reaction. and see if people were interested, were supporting the idea or not. But as I probably mentioned also in the other podcast, I don't do interviews, I don't prepare interviews. I like to spend time with people to see if they actually want to participate in the research, because there is this kind of you go there, you want something, but for me it's like, are they willing to give me something? And I want to create, first of all, human relationship, and then if this human relationship can be useful from both sides, then it's good to share information. But of course, there were also other situations where the sadhus were just very willing. And so they were like, yeah, why not ask? And so I could ask questions immediately. And that was quite surprising, because sometimes I'm not ready. But and then, you're like, okay, he wants to answer questions. I need questions. So for me, it's more like smooth, usually, the situation. So in the majority of the case, it takes like 1 month to fulfill the pattern I have in my mind. And in the case of, for example, of Jogi Baba, this Baba in the jungle, I went to meet him, and he knew that I was doing this research, but he was very busy. So we had like kind of a daily appointment. Every day he was giving me 30 minutes to talk about yoga, to show me asanas and explain things. So it was like, it's really, the field work is really framed around the person I'm with.
Yeah, actually, if it's okay, I want to read a passage from your book that talks about this, because I appreciate the kind of thoughtfulness you have about this reciprocity of this process with the sadhus. You write in the introduction, I did not follow a written questionnaire. I knew the kinds of questions and topics I wanted to talk about, and I tried to ensure they arose during the conversations. I might spend days without asking a single question simply because the timing was not right, or the ascetic was too busy or too tired to talk to me, and I did not want to be a further source of stress. In some cases, making me wait was a kind of test to verify whether I was really interested in listening. I consider making time to listen and to wait to be two of the most important tools in ethically qualitative ethnographic fieldwork. From a qualitative point of view, I see the researcher as the one who is there to learn from the interlocutor. It is the researcher who needs the subject. And the only way to prevent the process being one of stealing from them is to build relationships and find a way of paying them back. So, I mean, indeed, the sadhus really, they have given you so much, right, over the years. And I really appreciate your thoughtfulness here on this, as you write, the ethically qualitative ethnographic fieldwork. I think we can all learn a lot from that. But I also appreciate this idea of not just taking from them, but that you also wanted to give back in some way. Were there any ways that you found that you were able to give back to some of these sadhus, for their time and for their knowledge?
Oh, of course. I mean, first of all, very simple. If you're in an ashram, you help cleaning up, cutting vegetables, cooking, doing whatever it's requested. And of course, also buying things. And, in many situations, the dakshina was the way of paying back, really through money. Because especially these sadhus who are in small villages or have to take care of other people in the ashram, they need money. They need money to support themselves and to support the structure. So to give back some money, as it is a usually exchange also between a disciple or an interlocutor with the sadhu. Even like householder people, when they go to a sadhu to ask for any information or to any advice, they will give money back. So this is also what I did. Sometimes I gifted things that were necessary for the ashram. Sometimes I gave money, or if they asked for favors, I did what they asked me to do. And also, but I don't know if this could be important for them, even to write their names and to remember them at the end of the book, for me was a way of paying back, because all of them were important to me. And even if not all of them are mentioned in the book because it was impossible, they are there in a way or another. So even if probably they will never read the book because they cannot read English, I know that they are there, and I will tell them when I will meet them again.
I'm curious. I mean, I know it hasn't been out for that long, but have you had any interactions with any of them through WhatsApp or social media or in person? Like since the book has come out, have any of them seen the book and interacted in any way? Or
Now, only one, Sri Dayanand Puri, because he's very active on Facebook, and also he can speak a bit of Italian. So when it was his birthday, I wrote to him, and I also told him like, Maharaj, the book is out, and it was a blessing. So he was very happy. But now I'm going back for the Mahakumbh Mela, for the Kumbh Mela, and so I will meet them there. And I mean, the bad part is that I would love to give the book to all of them, but it's impossible. First, I cannot carry so many books, and second is also, I mean, I don't have them basically.
Yeah.
So it's also complicated, but I would love to do that, and probably I would love to print the photograph. So not all. I mean, more.
They might appreciate something like that.
Exactly,
more.
They like photographs also because it's still a memory of of that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned Jogi Baba and this sort of jungle. I mean, tell us. I mean, some of the conditions and places you're traveling are pretty far off the beaten path. You would sort of get leads from one sadhu or a friend or another. You mentioned Jogi Baba. Is there another sadhu or two in particular that really stands out when you look back at this time and the relationships that you built? Is there another one or two that, and maybe you could just share their story a little bit?
You mean like from a human point of view, or like as sadhu in themselves?
Either, whether it's about yoga or a human point of view of their story.
One is Garudas. I met this guru, this great guru from the Ramanujan Sampradaya, only once in Ujjain in 2016, the Ujjain Simast Mela, and he was really someone, I would say, someone with a very strong presence, with a very strong charisma. And I don't know if we mentioned this already, but I had the feeling when I was with him that he could really read my mind sometimes, because it was in the Mela, and he was doing this kind of a dhyan. It was a kind of dhyan training of meditation in the morning. So at the beginning, there were his devotees doing a bit of asanas, and then he was conducting the meditation. And I had the feeling he was really on everyone. He knew exactly what was happening in each of us, and it was very, very strong presence. Yes, so he was very. I was very impressed. And from a more human point of view, there is Jagannath Das, who's also from the Ramanandi Sampradaya, and Sri Dayanand Puri is Dashnami. They are very, I mean, I was very much attached to them because they got Diksha when they were child. And they maintain this kind of childish approach, but means like being very honest, like telling you the truth, even if he's not very much supportive of them as sadhu. And, like, oh, I would never do this because otherwise I will get, I don't know, fat, or like, oh, I earned some money and I was feeling shameful about that. So really small information that it makes you understanding how they are very honest with themselves, and therefore even they can be honest with you because they have nothing to hide about their past or their path.
So you mentioned they got diksha or initiation as children, but many sadhus come into the orders much later in life. Tell us just a little bit. I mean, I know it really varies, right, across individuals and traditions, but tell us a little bit about, some of the motivations for joining the sadhu societies, and just a little bit about, what that society looks like for them, and maybe that process of joining and becoming a sadhu.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tough society, I would say, from one point of view, because it's one of those society that once you enter, you cannot go back. So if you take that decision, you have to be sure about, where you are going. And so, for example, I saw this problem with those who got initiated as children, and then they grew up as a sadhu, and they are like stuck in the sadhu society. And if you are
And when you
stuck
say as children, does that mean that their parents made that decision for them, or did they choose as children to do that, or what do you think?
It's complicated because, I mean, India is a huge country, and the situations, especially in villages, are not good. So there are a lot of kids who simply disappears because they escape from hard condition. And so there are also children who don't want to study, and they like the sadhu society because they are attracted by sadhus. And as I said, it disappears. But there are also situations where families are poor, so they will give, they will donate the child to an ashram because it can be fed and this and that. I mean, there are very much several orphans as well can be adopted by sadhus. So there are different situations why a child can be part of the sadhu society. Sometimes sadhus, fail, so they have children, and so they are part of the society because they are actually their son. So it's a society, so it's very much complicated how one becomes a sadhu. But of course, if this happens later, I mean, there are also children who are motivated by religious purposes already. Why not? And this is also a motivation for those who get initiated later on in life.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once in in your fieldwork among sadhus, one thing that's interesting, I think historically there's often this blurring of tapas and yoga, these physical austerities and yoga and yogasana. We sort of see this historically in the sources all the way back to like the Mahabharata. There's this kind of blurring of these types of figures and physical activities. And then throughout a lot of scholarship too, sometimes scholars, I think, are just referring to Hindu ascetics and calling them yogis. And it's not always so clear if they're doing sort of the practices of yoga. So talk about this a little bit, how you approached this in your work, because not all sadhus are yogis, right? So,
Yes.
and you specifically were looking for the yogis among the sadhus.
Yeah.
So was that, how did you encounter that tension among, sadhus and sadhus who identify as yogis, or maybe their students or guru bhais, said, oh, go talk to the yogi over here. How did you find the yogis among the sadhus?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. Of course, if you are looking at the Nat Sampradaya, it's very easy because they have that title.
They're all yogis.
They are all yogi by name. So that's very easy. But on the other side, so that is a different situation, of course, because they are all yogi. But in the rest of the society, I could say that terms are important in the sadhu society because often sadhus recognize themselves by the practice they do. And so if you are doing the yoga sadhana and you do it like in an accomplished way, they will give you the title of yogi, even if you are not part of the Nat Sampradaya. So there is a strong idea of who is a yogi, a Mahayogi. And when I talk about yogi, is really someone who's accomplished in dhyan and samadhi. And the Mahayogi is the one who has overcome that level. And it's more like the yogi who has the power of doing everything. So it's really more related to power. And then in the sadhu society, the sadhu who has the knowledge, the knowledge of the kriyas and the asanas and the shat karma, that is a yogiraj. So you can see different nuances of the term yogi inside the sadhu society. So once you spend time with them, you realize that there are these differences, and then you can ask, more precise question, like who's our yogiraj. If you want to know about asanas and kriyas, you will look for a yogiraj, not a yogi, because you can be a yogi without being a yogiraj. Because in the sadhu society, yoga is dhyan, basically. And you don't need to go through all the steps like through asanas, because there are people who can get in control of the mind already. It's really related to the nature of the person. So maybe you are a person who has a very good control of the body already, the breath already. You can control your mind easily. So you can start a yoga sadhana, a religious discipline based on meditation, without going through all the other steps. Sometimes, as sadhu says, especially if you are young, you go through these physical steps because you are full of energy. So it's a way to subjugate the body and the energy inside the body. So you go through these more physical steps. And then you reach, of course, dhyan, because that's what is important.
Right. So today, of course, in the transnational yoga scene, yoga, as we know, is so synonymous with the practice of postures or asana. And you were looking for postures and asana practitioners among the sadhus. But as you just said, asana is not the kind of end all be all of yoga, and that it's more dhyan, a meditation, or samadhi, or power, those attainments that kind of characterize the greatest yogis. But they do practice asanas, right? So tell us a little bit about that, and maybe even how. I mean, do you think that that's changing? Well, maybe I was going to ask you about that later, but specifically about asanas, do you think? Because you were so privy to all of the textual and historical research being done as well about the history of asana. So you have a good sense of what we know, which asanas, we have historical records for, and which ones we don't. How do you see and view kind of the asana practices that are being done by the sadhus in that light?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends, because they don't give much of attention to asanas. And quite often, what kind of asanas they do are strictly related to the tradition, to the lineage they belong. So there are some of these kind of practices or groups of asanas that are done in specific groups, because it's the lineage that transmits this kind of asanas. But as you also mentioned, they don't give a lot of importance to asanas. So even if they learn how to practice them, often they keep it aside, because the idea is that if you do too many asanas, you are wasting your time, unless you need them to maintain your body fit and stable, because you need the body stable and fit to meditate. Because, of course, the longer you sit, the more your body will be stiff. So you need to have a body that is able to sit for a long time, and you can train it through maybe asanas. And so it's really, it depends on the groups, it depends on the sadhu, it depends also on the interest of the sadhus. And to go back to the question that you mentioned of the connection between tapas and also yoga, some sadhus learn and do asanas as a form of tapasya. So in that case, they will learn, like, let's say, the 84 asanas, because that is the tapasya package. So if you want to complete the tapasya, you have to finish these 84 asanas, and then the tapasya will be done. So it's really up to the situation. And again, it's very much based on the sadhu. But I really think that because of this boom of yoga, and especially because of the social media, because of every sadhu has a smartphone. Many have iPhones,
Mm-hmm.
often gifted by devotees, and so they have very much updated. They can go on YouTube. They can have followers abroad, and sometimes they have a foreign followers who teach them asanas because maybe they are curious, and and sometimes they know that some foreigners do them better. They have a better technique, so why not? So
Mm-hmm.
again, this is being honest sometimes. Like a nat yogi told me, like, if you want to learn asanas, I can give you the name of this Brazilian lady. She does fantastic asanas. And so it's just being honest.
Wow. In general, what would you say are their views about modern transnational yoga, if you will? It sounds like you're saying generally positive for most of them. They might even recommend a yoga teacher from Brazil for you if you're curious. How would you characterize their attitude toward the popularity of yoga around the world today?
I mean, it's very much from one side, there is the idea if people do posters, is very good because it's very good for the health. So why not? The problem is that to confuse, I mean, because of course, for them, yoga is a religious path, it's part of their sadhana. So what they associate to the meaning of yoga is like a path that leads to a religious goal. And what is at the end can be moksha, can be, the vision of God, but it has a religious end. So in their mind is this kind of disconnection of the religious path with a kind of religious goal. That's the problem. And also the fact that there are so much money involved. So the idea that through yoga you make a lot of money, it clashes a bit because it's a spiritual path. So it's like, how can you do a religious path thinking about the money that you can make? So you are back in Maya. And if you are back in Maya, in this kind of illusion in money and this and that, so you're ruining the path, which is based on you start with the vairagya, with the detachment. Again, they are in ascetic context, a religious context. So you start removing everything, abandoning everything. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
I want to ask you a little bit about the idea of the positionality of the scholar. I know you've spoken about this in many places, but I think you have a unique perspective on this. So I think it's worth talking about again. In academia broadly, but I think especially in anthropology, we talk about this positionality of the scholar or the ethnographer, the differences between insider, outsider perspectives, participant observer, this question of whether to receive initiations or not, to enter into an order, to become an insider, this sort of going native approach, perhaps.
Mhm.
The differences between secret or private teachings
Mm.
versus the more public dimensions of yoga or religious practices. So just tell us a little bit how you approached this issue in your work.
Yeah, I approach it in a very easy way, basically. I didn't get initiation because I always declare I'm not a religious person. I don't have any specific faith and I don't follow any guru. So it was just normal not to get initiated because it would be like just to fake, right? An interest that was not there. And also because, as you mentioned, when you get initiated, you get information that you are not supposed to share. And instead, for me, the purpose of research is to share shareable information. So it was, I mean, that's why, I mean, my positionality is quite easy. I want to share information that can be shared. And the good way to do that, is not to be initiated, because also not being initiated, you can move easily from one part to the other, because if you get initiated, you have to be serious in the sense that you have to spend time with your guru, because this is what a disciple is supposed to do, to spend time and learn from one guru. So if I were doing this for myself, I would have done like, a research focused on one guru if I had a guru, but I didn't. And this wasn't the purpose of of the research. So in that sense, it's very easy. I mean, my positionality is more related to the fact that I'm a white person, and this is always with me when I do field work in India. You have to acknowledge the power that we have, unfortunately, just being white person. And you can see this also looking at traditional Hindu religious orders, where many foreigners get important titles while Indians don't. And I think there should be more awareness and acknowledgement of this kind of power relationship sometimes, because it's like, why foreigners, people can get these titles and not like, I don't know, Dalit, untouchable, or low caste people, or women sometimes. So I'm always having this awareness. Like, I can access places where Indian women could not. And I know that. And that's why you find that also in the book. I acknowledge that I had more power than, unfortunately, for example, an Indian person. But of course, an Indian person would have had a better knowledge of the language. So it's really like, you balance your position in the different contexts.
Yeah, I was going to ask that as a follow-up. That really struck me in the book. I mean, on the one hand, you have these sort of strikes against you, if you will, as you approach this, as a foreigner, as a woman in this male-dominated ascetic arena, as a non-sadhu. But as you said, in some ways, being a foreigner actually helped you and granted you, more access than you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah. First of all, because there is the idea of atiti deho bhav. So you're a guest. So as a guest, they will accept you. So I was, for example, even in the last Magh Mela, I was sitting in the camp of the Tyagis, and they allowed me to sit on the asanas that usually are like, just the places where sadhus sit. And I was feeling guilty. I was feeling bad because this, like, usually older people, lay Indian people could not sit there. And I told them, I don't want to sit here. But they told me, like, shut up, do what we say. You are our guest. You sit there. So it's really kind of, as white people, we have a different, they behave with us in a different way because we are their guests in any case. And so we have just to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I appreciate you acknowledge that. You even say, therefore one might wonder how I could undertake my research at all and whether my being a woman, and we might add a foreigner, has affected my data collection. Would your responses have been different if somebody else had been carrying out this research? Recently, you've been giving some talks. You did it at the Yoga Vidya online conference and as well as the Yoga Darshana conference in Hamburg on this idea of performativity. This notion that certain types of practices are actually being performed in a certain way in front of an audience, in a social setting, that this was probably the case historically, that sadhus would perform certain tapasya or asana practices at different melas or festivals. And we see that today at the Kumbh Mela and other events. But I wanted to ask you, did you ever think, question, I think you did, because you sort of you suggest this, that maybe your informants are performing for the ethnographer in certain ways, and that the answers you're getting maybe might be affected in some way because they're sort of telling you what you want to hear in some ways.
I mean, I don't know about the answers because, but more for the photos and the videos that I collected, that's for sure. But that is also, as you mentioned, that approach of performativities, especially during the festival, because I was taking pictures, of course. I asked for permission for videos, but together with me, there are tons of other people because nowadays everyone in India has a smartphone. So I think even in the past, there was this, it's a kind of a way of attracting people. I think even the Buddha mentioned that you use miracles or you use things just to attract devotees because people need somehow to be attracted, something like shining to be attracted. And when you use the body in a way that can astonish others, it can work. So I really think that sadhus did and do use this kind of practices to attract devotees and this and that, and sometimes they overdo the practices because I was there with the camera. So for example, in during the dhuni tap that the Tyagis did, I mean, they do a lot of asanas as well, of course, but I think when I was there with my camera, there was my one after the other they started, and it was I mean, I was happy, of course, but I asked myself, like, are they doing that because I'm here, or they would have done the same even if I was not? But about the questions, I don't know that, because it's, as I said, I don't prepare interviews, so they are just the questions, of course, arising during the conversations. So of course another person would have had a complete different approach or conversation, but if the question were the same, I think also the answer would have been the same, also because, as I said, they are not very deep questions. They are not related to secrets that they could decide if to disclose or not. It's, in a sense, I would say that the book is very simple, because I don't disclose like anything like, oh my God, this has never been said before. So it's just, I would say it's simple, because it just puts just basic understanding of practices and approaches, which I think could be shared with anyone.
I'm curious, looking back, maybe before you started the project, or maybe even during the writing process, you did all this field work, you recorded, transcribed probably hundreds, if not thousands of hours of interviews, right?
Yes.
I'm curious.
That's the part I don't like very much.
I bet. And I'm sure there's so much that didn't make it into the book that you
Yes.
probably had to cut out. I'm sure, the director's cut, I'm curious though, like, were there certain assumptions or ideas or arguments that you had that you thought might be the case? And then I wonder if at some point, did anything surprise you? Did anything change in your mind as you were working on this, whether it was early on during the field work or maybe during the writing process? Is there anything that stands out to you that like surprised you, as you wrote this book?
While I was writing the book, I mean, not much, because I spent so much time with the notes and the material, so it was part of me. So of course it wasn't surprising me at all. But as I mentioned also in the other podcast, really the main surprise was the approach towards Hatha Yoga, and the fact that sadhus associate Hatha Yoga with tapasya, because that is when I started the research, and I had my cage, the Hatha Yoga cage, related to the textual sources. And so that was like a bit the issue at the beginning, especially when sadhu said, like, why do you want to research Hatha Yoga? Hatha Yoga is if you want to make chapati, or if you want to eat chapati, you eat chapati. Who's gonna read your research? So because they were thinking about the intention, the stubbornness of the method, and that for me was really a turning point, because then it's like, okay, it means that we really have to ask these questions, because the topic of Hatha Yoga was not arising, because the idea was completely different. And so this is something.
Say more about that. I mean, we've talked about it elsewhere, but I don't think we touched on it here today. I mean, so what is their attitude of Hatha Yoga
Hatha
specifically?
Yoga. The attitude is very much connected to tapasya. Is how do you do tapasya? How can you bear austerities? Because you have heart, because you have this stubbornness, this deep intention that will enable you to go through the pain of the tapasya, the time that you need to reach the goal of the tapasya, and so on. So this, I would say, is the 90% of sadhus have this idea that Hatha Yoga is strictly related to stubbornness, and there can be different kind of stubbornness. And when the sadhu, the yogi, becomes stubborn, they say that's dangerous because it can get so much power. And we know this connection with tapasya and the power that the sadhus can get because of the energy, the fire they accumulated. So that is the first understanding of Hatha Yoga among sadhus. And then for me, it was also interesting to see how the other understandings are strictly related to earlier layers of Hatha Yoga. So those who connected with pranayama, so strongly with the control of the breath. That is one of the first understanding of Hatha Yoga in textual sources. So this was interesting for me to see how these kind of layers of meanings were kept in the sadhu society. And of course, also the idea of Hatha Yoga as a collection of kriyas, shatkarmas, these and that, and which is more, let's say, traditional textual understanding of what Hatha Yoga is.
Okay, so I have a couple questions that came in from Instagram, Daniela.
Oh la la.
I mentioned I was going to be interviewing you, and a couple people put some questions in. So
okay, that's interesting.
We've got two questions here, sort of from the audience, if you will. This one's from Julian.rj, and Julian asks, wants to know about if the sadhus use texts to learn, and if they are writing any texts themselves, maybe in vernacular languages or something with their teachings. So what can you say about their relationship with written texts?
Of course, we are talking, I mean, not in general with the sadhu society, because there are different branches, there are different lineages who will use the textual sources. But let's say that those more concentrated on physical practices, they won't use textual sources. I mean, I've seen sadhus mentioning or reciting what they thought were lines or shlokas from some specific textual sources, but they were not, because then I confronted with James Mellinson and Jason Birch, and they could not relate to that specific text. So I think there is an idea of some text, and they mention the titles of some very important texts and some basic ideas that are transmitted orally. Of course, they are there, but probably, and as this also our questioner from what is the name of the person who asked the question?
Julian.
Julian, yeah, as probably the writing can be there, and it can be writing, can be sketches as well, because, for example, especially if they are doing pranayam, they can use some sketches and some yantra to support their practices, and they will give this to their disciples as well. So that's why also I said before, we should really look at vernacular sources, because if there are notes, let's say, that they take, especially for their disciples, they will be in vernacular sources. And for example, in the book, I mentioned a few vernacular sources, and I really think that in these vernacular sources, we can grasp the feeling of the practice, what the practice produce in the sadhu, rather than a description of what happens and the theoretical background. It's really more kind of imaginative, because especially when you are going deep into some practices like dhyana or samadhi, it's difficult to find the right words to explain those kind of experiences. So yeah, I think vernaculars could be, and also, yeah, what they produce today, we didn't look at that. I mean, the sadhus I spent time with, they were not writing anything at that specific moment.
Thank you. Okay, and the next question is related. The user's name is Fraternnoxvo. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And the question is, how impactful does Patanjali continue to be within sadhu society? Did you encounter, I mean, do they reference Patanjali or the Yoga Sutras at all?
But very rarely, I would say. And in some cases, I would say that they are mentioning it because it's fashionable, and especially between lay people. So again, not only with me, like I will mention you what you're looking for, but in some cases also like, Indian people who are receiving a lot of inputs from the Western, but also a kind of going back to their own sources. So there is this interest also towards Patanjali. But I would say in general, no. They all, especially when they mention the Ashtanga yoga, not necessarily they will refer to Patanjali, especially because in the sadhu society, yama and niyama are compulsory. So it's already part of any of these orders. So it's not really the case. Also because these sampradāyas have their own theoretical background, very strong. They come from religious traditions with their own textual sources, even on yoga. So they don't need Patanjali because that
I
is
wonder
related to
though,
another background.
you do write about this, how the yamas and niyamas, they do reference this quite a bit, right? So I wonder if their understanding of yama and niyama, how informed that is by Patanjali's text versus other hatha yoga or tantric sources that have, there's these different lists of yamas and niyamas,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I mean, when we talk about yama and niyama, they don't give exactly what is inside. So it's more, I think it's more related to the rules of their own orders, because they have this kind of rules, and each specific sampradaya has the yama and niyama to follow. So it's I would say it's more spread, even for people who don't follow the yoga sadhana. They will have to follow the
Sure.
duties and the rules, because they
Yeah.
will be otherwise kicked out from the group.
Especially brahmacharya, right?
Especially brahmacharya, although, as I mentioned,
Although,
not always. Yeah, sometimes people, yeah, they're just
well, you have
humans.
you have the ideal, and then you have
Yeah, the human being.
the human being and the
Yeah.
grassroots. What happens,
Yeah, I
on the
mean,
ground.
even if you are not a grassroots, but a very rich and very educated
That's
and very
true.
international sadhus, sometimes you are even more, yeah, the danger can be even, yeah, wider.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's see. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, but I think we'll kind of start to wrap up. There's so many great stories in throughout your book. There is one I wanted if you could share a little bit about. There's you mentioned you were having these headaches for a while during your field work, and some of the sadhus offered particular cures or even suggesting reasons why you were getting your headaches. And I thought
Yeah.
that was just interesting and is quite informative about some of the theory, and as well as the practices of how they view the body and the mind. So tell us a little bit about your headaches and the sadhus' remedies.
Yeah. So one of the explanation was the evil eye, because I was spending too much time with sadhus and I was a young girl. So maybe there were some people looking at me with the evil eye. So, this could have been influenced my headache. So in that case, the cure was a kind of a ceremony, a small ritual to remove the evil eye. In another situation, it was like, you study too much, you work too much, you should just relax and take it easy, study less. And then I think in that case, this sadhu gave me aloe vera, and so
Mm.
just put he broke the branch of the aloe, and he was putting like on the forehead, on the neck, and so on. And then there was another sadhu using ayurvedic cream and telling me what kind of posture I could do to put more the how to say, the flux of the blood in my head, and then through that to remove the headache. Yeah, so
And
yeah, that was interesting.
and were any of these methods successful? Did you have any headache relief?
Sometimes, I mean, I had this headache for some time, so I don't know if it was the ibuprofen that I eventually took,
Yeah.
or some of this. But yeah, the aloe vera was quite effective because it was very refreshing. So I don't know if that was a kind of placebo effect, but yeah, but it was interesting indeed because I was always like, I have a headache, and they were very caring for me. Like, oh my God, poor thing.
So to kind of wrap up here, we mentioned before, I think there's so many misunderstandings, stereotypes, even this kind of romanticization about this idea of being a renunciate and an ascetic, a sadhu. What do you think are some of the main misunderstandings or stereotypes about these sadhus, and what are some of the things you think that your book can do to counteract that? What are for people reading this book, what are some of the main things that you hope that people will take away?
That really depends. I mean, as you said, that all the sadhus are yogi and they all do like yoga or some, yeah, this kind of meditation can be much more complex. And also that they are isolated and, they live disconnected with the world. And I hope the book really stressed the fact that the sadhu society was always and is deeply involved in the society, let's say in our society, because I mean, of course, in India, both of them need each other to survive. And especially the sadhu society, without the lay society, cannot exist, basically. Even if there are sadhus who go and isolate themselves, they can do that because also they are supported by a tradition of people who engage with the lay society. And so it's just to be more realistic. This, I hope the book will just help people to have a clearer idea of, there is not just the orange clothing, is not just rudraksha, is not just moksha. It can be much more complicated because there are so many paths and so many lives and spiritual disciplines that a sadhu can do. So this book aims to complicate the image of the sadhu.
Yeah. One thing I did want to ask you actually that I forgot to mention earlier, today modern yoga is also kind of conceived as this yoga class. The instruction, the pedagogy of yoga is taught usually, but not always, but usually in this group setting, this idea of the yoga class. And I wonder how you can contrast that with how yoga is taught, in thinking about the pedagogy of yoga amongst sadhus. Are they taught one-on-one, guru to shishya, or is it done in a small group setting? Did you encounter sadhu yoga classes? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think there can be different environment. There can be a sadhu teaching asanas to, for example, kids in a village. So a kind of practice for the kids, for making them doing some gymnastic. And the training can be different if the disciple and the practitioner is a disciple. And I think sadhus can be very tough with the disciple because it's I think it's more based on physical violence, like kicking, slapping if they don't do it correctly. It's very tough. I would say it's, I don't know, maybe school in Italy in the 50s, something like that. You have to do your homework. If you don't do it properly, something's going to happen. And some sadhus told me, like, their gurus taught them, if not with the good way, in the other way. But they were also like, I deserved that because I was very, hot-minded. I was very indisciplined. I didn't have a lot of discipline and this and that. So it's like, guru-shishya relationship. They always think the guru is right. But most in that case, it's more one-to-one because it's really the practice has to fit that body, has to fit that shape. So it has to be like that. And as I mentioned also in the book, a sadhu won't teach to all of his disciples the same thing because each person has to follow an individual path. So yoga sadhana in the ascetic context is not for everyone. So only specific person can follow that as a religious path. So the guru has to decide and has to see who is actually the person who will be fit for that.
All right. Well, now that the book is finished, and after your book tour, your international
already finished
podcast book tour is finished. What's next? I know you're working on a new research project now. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm still in the Sadhu Samaj, but with a different perspective. Let's say not more on yoga and Hatha Yoga, but I'm looking at the Kinnar Akhara. That is this new religious group stemming from the Hijra society, but entering the field of Akhara, the male Akhara. And they are, let's say, transgender women, if we can use this kind of Western term. So it's quite, I mean, in 2019, I was quite shocked because they were really challenging the male, strongly patriarchal world of the Akhara. And they were able to conquer a spot, and now they are linked to the Juna. So they really made history. They are making history in this kind of very traditional environment. Then it's more complicated, the story as usual, but it's really interesting to see a new group developing, creating its own identity, and interacting with different power dynamics.
And so are you working on another book project related to that?
Now I'm writing articles because I learned that in the academic world is more important to write articles.
Yeah.
So I'm writing articles, and then maybe I will collect everything in a book. Or I don't know. Let's see.
No pressure,
I'm not thinking
no
about it. No, exactly.
So I know you're not looking at yoga in particular, but amongst the Kinnar Akhara, but I'm curious, and I really don't know. Like, I mean, they are in this ascetic world. I mean, are they doing tapasya or any yogic practices?
No. They keep doing, let's say, the practices of Hijra. So they bless, they dance, they sing. And at the same time, they have introduced the more Brahmanical or Tantric practices. So there is this Kinnar, Bhavani Ma Nath Valmiki. She is a follower of the Das Mahavidya, so the 10 goddesses. So she does this kind of tantric puja during the Mela festival. So it's very interesting how they are appropriating. I would not say appropriating. They are finally, shifting the power in the hands of other performers. But they also do like more traditional Brahmanical pujas as well. So they're blending together several traditions.
Yeah, very fascinating. Well, Daniela G, thank you so much for your time today, and really congratulations again on this groundbreaking book, From Tapas to Modern Yoga. Encourage all of our listeners to go out and get a copy. It's incredibly well researched, well written. It's also very well illustrated. I mean, there's so many wonderful photographs from your fieldwork of
in
sadhus.
Color. That's important.
The
colorful,
color?
Colorful image, not this
colorful,
kind of boring.
Absolutely. It's not black and white. These are beautiful color images. Also, lots of photographs of temples and sculptures, which I appreciate. And really, just congrats. It's a impressive and important work, and happy to have you here to celebrate it. And folks, please also go check out her online course, YS 103, at yogicstudies.com. It's available in English and Italian.
Wow.
Daniela came back and taught the course again in Italian. So if there's any Italian listeners out there, you can actually take an updated version of the course with all of the lectures and Q&As recorded in Italian. So very cool.
Thank you so much, Seth, for having me. And thank you for reading the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Until we meet again, Daniela, please take care. And thanks to all of our listeners.
Yes, thank you so much.
Please subscribe and feel free to leave a comment or a like.
Sure.
And all right, take care, everyone.
Bye.